Hello, everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Dr. Melissa Mann, and I'm doing our October Talk to the Entities extravaganza amazingness. I don't remember what we called this. How does it get better than that? So, I wanted to tell you a story today about knowing what you know and an experience that I had with an entity. I don't know, maybe it was like a year and a half, 2 years ago now. And it really changed something for me and the way um, that I show up with entities and that I trust myself. The Talk to the Entities tools, if you've ever taken a class and if you haven't, one of the greatest gifts that they've given me is really this awareness of knowing that I know and what I know and actually trusting that. And, it's one of those specialties that's so interesting because a lot of people come to talk to the entities because they know they have a capacity with entities. And other people come because they're curious about it and may or may not have acknowledged that they have a capacity with entities. Not everybody who has an entity capacity hears voices or sees them. And some people do. And that's amazing also. But for me personally, I never saw them or heard them. And so I didn't necessarily know that I had this capacity. And it's really been an exercise in listening to the whispers and really like leaning into the downloads and the awareness that shows up that I wouldn't have known, I think, if I hadn't had, even it was like in foundation class when we got to the entity stuff that I was like, wait, I need to know more. I like wanted to spend like a day on Talk to the Entities tools and clearings and all of that. And the facilitator was like, might you have a capacity with entities? And I was like, no, I don't hear or see things. And, now I can look back and be like, wow, but it was that interest, the intrigue of it that like led me to want to explore all of this more. So if you're listening to this and, you're like, well, I don't know if I actually have a capacity. If you're even listening to this series, if you've been listening to people's stories and tools and things like that, likely you do indeed have a capacity, but there is this muscle in really starting to trust yourself and know what you know. So, I was having a conversation in the airport coming back from the 6th day, and I was talking about Talk to the Entities and my love of it. And I said, it's really a knowing class. It's really about starting to trust you in a totally different way. So let me tell you my story and then we'll see where that goes. But so I was driving and listening to the Talk to the Entities book, which if you haven't listened to, please listen to. And I listen to it kind of like all the time. So I can't tell you how many times through I'd listened to the book, but I was listening to it driving and I got this hit to just like press pause and kind of see if there was someone there to communicate. And the first person that popped into my awareness was a person who's actually still alive. And it was my mom's ex-husband's son, right? So like her stepson from before I was born. And I was like, well, that doesn't really make sense. And then I realized it wasn't him. He's just the person I actually like know. But his brother had died when I was a child. And so I was like, wait, is this actually him? And I got, a strong yes. And I was like, okay. And so when I say I got a yes, sometimes it is just this like download or this awareness. Or for me, when something is light, I'll often take like a deep breath. So that's how it shows up for me. Obviously, it shows up differently for you. But if you're using the Access Consciousness tools already and you know kind of what light feels like for you or heavy feels like for you, it's often that in that like, okay, like, is this him? And it was just like, oh yeah, that's definitely it. So, I said, I don't really talk to your brother if that's like what you're after. And he's like, no, that's not it. I'm here for you. And I was like, okay. So I was really curious. I was like, I didn't know you. You died when I was a child. Um, And I live in Chicago, and I always, for the most part, I've moved around a little bit, but for the most part, I've always lived in the Chicago suburbs. And I know that he died in Aspen, Colorado, which is on the other side of the United States. And so I was like, well, okay, I don't actually know any of that. So he gave me the info to sort of like Google like some information. So I looked up his name, and the first thing that came up was indeed him, had died Aspen, Colorado, blah, blah. But the next thing that came up was buried in Batavia, Illinois. Well, I live in Batavia, Illinois, which is 35 miles west of Chicago. And I know he never lived here. He lived in a northern suburb about an hour north of me when he did live in Illinois. And I was like, that doesn't make any logical sense. So I did a little digging, found the cemetery that he was buried in, which is a mile from my house. So this is crazy. And I was like, okay, it was a Friday afternoon. I wasn't working. And I was like, I'm driving to the cemetery. So I went over there, literally a mile from my house. And this was still during COVID. So it must have been like 2 years ago. So I pull up, I walk in and I ask the lady, can you just tell me, this might be crazy. Can you just tell me if this person is buried here? And she pulls out her like old school file cabinet and, looks through the files and like, yeah, here's his file. And I was like, well, can you tell me where the grave is? And she was like, oh, we're not that organized. Like, here's a map. I think he's back in this general region in the periphery. I know he's not in the mausoleum, but beyond that, good luck. And I was like, okay. So I had a little time, but I was like, well, also I knew he was still like hanging with me. So I asked him, I was like, can you like tell me where your gravestone is? And this was one of those cemeteries where the gravestones are like in the ground, so you have to like stare at the ground as you're looking, as opposed to like, reading up. So I'm walking, trying to like uncover the gravestones. And I was like, okay, where do I go? And he was like, go right. So I go right, and I'm looking and I'm looking and I'm looking. And then he was like, no, go left. And I was like, you just told me to go right. I was like, oh my God, I'm officially crazy. I'm following a ghost. I'm making this up. There is no way any of this is real. And I was like, man, like I'm either totally losing my shit or like, you got to show me, like, if you want me to find this. And so he was like, no, it's by your car. And I was like, what? It's like, there's nothing by my car. I parked like in the back of the kind of parking lot thing. The mausoleum was right there, but they told me clearly his body wasn't in there. So I was like, all right. So we kind of did this back and forth thing for a while. I'm watching the time. I know I have to get my kids from school. And I was like, hey, like, I don't really know what we're doing here, but if you want me to find this, you need to be a lot clearer. And I got a very strong, it's by your car. And I was like, okay. So I went back to my car and I'm like, there's no graves here. I don't get it. And so I actually like start to leave. I was like, I need to go. But the mausoleum wall was right here. And I looked and it was literally like where I opened my door, right in my eyesight. And I was like, oh, they were wrong. That's exactly where he was buried. So I was like, well, that's insane. And I found it. And I was like, okay, I found it. Like, what was the point? Like, why did we do this? Like, what was the point of this like wild goose chase of trying to find your grave? And he was like, I just want you to know that you're not crazy and that you do know. And I was like, holy shit. And every once in a while where I like have these moments where I'm like, am I making this all up? Is this literally all in my head? He'll kind of pop back in with that reminder of like, no, And it, for me, was the first time that I was like, this is like, you get these downloads and I was, and you're like, am I making this up? Am I just creating this in my head? I talk to people all the time when I talk to the entities tools or in classes, we're like, how do I know I'm not making it up? How do I know it's not just like me creating this? Well, it's moments like that where things you couldn't have known otherwise, where an entity pops into your awareness, whether it was somebody you knew in life or this life or not, and it gives you some whisper of like, keep going. You're not crazy, but nobody ever teaches you to know. When we were growing up, at least for me, the idea was to have the answer, but not to follow your knowing. It was to look to the teacher, look to the authority figure, look to somebody else to tell you what you know, to tell you what they know, actually, not even what you know. They teach you what they know so that you can know what they know. Nobody ever teaches you to know what you know. And so, when you look at these tools and what shows up, I mean, I have so many experiences like that where you get this download and you can either go into doubt or something else. We at the last Talk to the Entities, um, Turbo Advanced Summit, and then facilitator training. Shannon O'Hara's like stuff wasn't working. The technical mic or something wasn't working. And she's like, should we clear the entities? And suddenly it started working. But it was so funny because the thing she pointed out was how many of us went to like, see, they are real. And like, even though obviously we were all there at an advanced entities class, there was no like question of whether or not we believed in entities at this point. But there's often that like needing to prove that like, yes, they are real. See, I'm not crazy. But how much have we had in the media, in our whole world, that if you hear voices, you're crazy. If you see things that other people can't see, that you must be nuts. I mean, backstory, I'm a clinical psychologist. And one of the questions that I ask people, I ask it a bit differently these days, but I was trained to ask people, do you ever see things other people can't see? Or do you ever hear things that other people can't hear? And it's so funny now because now I have a lot more questions of, tell me about it. And no, I promise this isn't going in your report, because it's been made in this reality that then you have something wrong with you. But knowing what I know now, it's quite the opposite. And I've seen, God, I had this client who I just got the sense he had a massive entity capacity, but couldn't sleep. Just talked about like loudness a lot, but never specifically said he was hearing voices. And finally one day I said to him, this was only like, I don't know, a month ago, um, like, can I ask you something sort of like off the record? Like, do you hear voices? And he was like, oh, I know the right answer to that question. I know I'm not supposed to tell you that. And and he was like, but yeah. And we talked about it. And I was like, all right, next question. Like, do you believe in ghosts? And he was like, I know my house is haunted. And then we were able to have this beautiful conversation. And he was like, wow, like I thought I was crazy. I've thought I was crazy my whole life. And I know that that's like the one thing I should never tell a professional, that I can hear or that I am hearing things. He didn't necessarily see it as a capacity yet. And we talked about it and I gave him the entity tools. And I've, seen him like every week to every other week since. And now, I mean, we just actually went back up to like being seen once a month because he's like, that was actually what was required. Now it's totally different knowing that I'm not crazy, that I actually am aware of ghosts and that I can be the dominant entity and change it. And it's been so beautiful to watch that. And I've had lots of that show up where, people don't even want to tell you what they're aware of. But once they do, and you can have a conversation of like, hey, what if you actually know something? What if you're not crazy? And what if you don't have to have somebody give you some kind of tools on how to manage your anxiety, depression, something else, when it's actually an entity awareness that you could use to, that if you had the tools, you could have way more ease and stop making yourself wrong for and stop trying to hide it or not allow yourself to be what you're aware of, but instead use that awareness in a way that creates your life. And I've just seen these like incredible, massive changes. I never meant to go into that story, but it's something that like is showing up more and more. Is people like when they get that they do know something, that it's not all in their head, that they are aware of something, it creates something different. But nobody, like I said, nobody ever taught us that. So one of the other things that I've seen show up, I just facilitated a Talk to the Entities class a couple weeks back now. And but it's so cool because you see people in the same way. I mean, I have it show up sort of in this like therapy practice and then in a different place in a access class. But even so, people in access classes will say, well, I don't actually know, I don't hear things, I don't see things, much like myself. And we broke off into groups and sort of did a thing where we have an entity kind of come help us, just to practice on essentially. And there was a lady in class who really didn't realize that she knew things and got a whole download from an entity that she had known and was really able to receive the message. And it was so cool because you could see it's like a switch turn on of like, oh, I do know something. I am getting a whole download. But we have so much noise in our lives that we don't necessarily stop and ask and use these tools until we have them, until we know to use them, to be able to use our awareness, trust our awareness. And that's like where you start to include the spirit world in your daily life and living, where it changes things. It changes your life, and it also changes the consciousness on the planet. I was just re-listening, like, as I was getting ready this morning to, Gary Douglas was talking about, how he was I was re-listening to the 6th Day, sorry, ADHD. I should finish my thought. And I was listening to his story from the 6th Day on how he was, like, in a cashier line, and he was aware that the cashier was just very grumbly with everybody and was like, "Here's your change," And he was like, "Oh, this man has, like, a lot of entities with him. I'm just gonna clear the entities," and cleared the entities from, the man in line or the cashier. And he got up there and he said, now he smiled at me. And he's like, that's what changes the world, is like you sort of use these sprinkles of consciousness, of entity awareness, of entity tools, and, not only to start to trust yourself, which, I mean, that all by itself changes the world, but how much also can, like, those of us who do know this stuff can empower others to know that they actually know also. And if we were living in a world where everybody knew what they knew, oh my goodness. I mean, that's, sort of the target of access consciousness. So, yeah, if you haven't played before, you haven't made it to a Talk to the Entities class yet, or you haven't read the book, start somewhere. And, if you pull your barriers down and don't go into the doubt, the distraction that is, well, I must be making this up, I must be crazy. If you didn't go into any of that and actually allowed yourself to know what comes, what downloads you get, what awareness you have, then see what shows up. See how much fun you can have with this. And it isn't to make it significant nearly as much as it's to have joy with it and have ease and to really start to know and trust you. So I think that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for being here with me on a little bit of my ADHD entity tangent. And, if you have questions about any of this stuff, please go to the Talk to the Entities website. And ask in this Facebook page, and feel free to reach out to me also. So whatever you require, and I will see you all somewhere in the world soon. Bye.